hand indicating that I have been to Disney a few times and want to go back. I'm proud to say, I've never been lost in Disney. Sometimes I think I know Disney better than I know like where I live. But I will say, growing up, I had the other challenge, which was my parents would lose me, oftentimes in the Gadsden Mall in Sears. And it was because of a choice I would make, because I thought it was cool, and that was they had these round racks with clothing hanging all around them, and if you crawled underneath, you could stand up perfectly in the center of all the clothes. And it's probably more fun to meet Disney security than Sears security. But I met them several times, and then I wasn't allowed to go back to Sears. But that's just part of life. I do want to thank everyone who did participate in the Envision focus groups. That was wonderful. The information coming out of those is tremendous. And I do hope that you will take the chance to use the QR code and do the survey if you didn't get to go to one of the in-person groups. I would hope that you would wait and do the survey after the sermon, maybe sometime this afternoon, but that's up to you. But I do hope that you'll do that. We want to get as much information as we can as we're dreaming about where God is calling this church to go to as we move forward, seeking to always follow His will. Well, today we are continuing moving our way through the I am statements of Jesus. And these were while we hear them as very powerful statements of faith, of who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do, in Jesus' time, these were very controversial statements. Not because of the content, but because He uses that word at the beginning of each one. It's translated, I am, but what He's using is the most ancient name for God. The name that God gave Himself in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament when He tells Moses, tell my people, I am who I am has sent you. And that word was Yahweh, I am. And by the time of Jesus, when Jesus was in ministry in our world, no one said the name of God. No one said Yahweh because they deemed that it was too holy even to say. And here's Jesus applying it to Himself. Not just saying it in worship of God, but instead applying it to Himself. I am. And I've always wondered what the disciples did the first time they heard it. How shocked they must have been. And every time they heard it, I wonder if they looked around trying to see who was there and who might have overheard Him say this. And did they notice that He used Yahweh? But here He goes again. John, the 14th chapter, the 6th verse. Jesus looks at His disciples and says, Yahweh, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I know that if we back up and read the entire chapter of John, you would this 14th chapter, you would probably pick up on how familiar the words are. The 14th chapter of John, you have selected verses that over the years have been pulled out and been put into a reading that is often done at times of loss and in funeral services and memorial services because it's very comforting wording. And that's not surprising because that's what Jesus is intending in the 14th chapter. He is trying to comfort His disciples. He's trying to prepare them for His upcoming death. The setting of the scene for this is in the upper room. In Jerusalem, it's located down in what is called the City of David area of Jerusalem, and that's where the upper room was located. He and His disciples are seated around a U-shaped table called a triclinium, and He is seated around the table with them. And He knows that this is the last meal that they will ever share together before His death. But they don't know that. They're there because it's Passover. But he knows that after the dinner ends, after the meal is over, he will take the disciples and he will leave. He'll travel and go up across the Temple Mound and down into the Kidron Valley and then back up the Mount of Olives. And he'll take Peter, James, and John with him as he goes into a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, for prayer. And he knows that that night will be when he'll be betrayed and when he'll be arrested. He knows that trials will come. The disciples don't know that by 9 o'clock the very next morning, Jesus will be crucified. So he's sitting at this supper, knowing all he knows and knowing how limited their information seems to be. He takes the opportunity to begin to comfort them. And so when we read these words, we find that they are still comforting. Even generations later, they're still comforting. When we go through a time of loss, they still speak to us. He looks at the people around that table, the faces he's traveled with for 3 years. And he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I tell you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and I will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I'm going. And here's one of those moments where the disciples show that they don't quite get it. They're confused and they don't know that Jesus is about to die, and they don't understand what he's saying. And so the apostle Thomas speaks up. And Thomas says, Lord, how do we know the way to the place where you're going when we don't even know where you're going? It seems like a logical question. If you don't have the privilege of knowing what happens in chapter 15 through 21, it seems like a logical question. And so here's where Jesus gives his I am statement. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. This phrase doesn't simply give Thomas the information that he needed and that we need, that the way to God is through Jesus, but it also ties together all that he's saying in this passage. It helps us understand how he could tell us that bold statement, let not your hearts be troubled. I know the I am statements are bold statements that he makes, but let not your hearts be troubled is a bold statement too. Because there are many things in our lives that can trouble our hearts. I mean, think about that phrase. Let not your hearts be troubled. The word for trouble in Greek that's translated here to mean troubled, it actually means shaken up or disturbed or severely bothered. And so he's saying, don't let your hearts be shaken up or disturbed. Don't let your hearts be severely bothered, because he knows what they're about to go through. And he knows what we go through. He knows that when we see tragedy and when we see evil in our world, when things fall apart, when we face sorrow and loss, our life feels like it's been shaken up, bothered, severely disturbed. And he tells them and he tells us that we don't have to be shaken up when those things come or when those things happen, because we can believe in God and we can believe in him, and he can help us. He can show us the way and the truth and the life, regardless of what we're experiencing in that moment. But we have to believe in him. See, that's key. One commentary on this passage says that in John's gospel, believe is a very important word. How do you access new life in Jesus? You believe. You trust him. In John's gospel, actually the word believe is used 98 times throughout the gospel. So that sort of drives home the point that believing in Jesus is a critical message for us. So Jesus is telling us that we believe in him. And when we do that, well, then he can give us the ability to not have our hearts shaken up when our world suddenly changes, when things we thought were aren't. He can be with us. He can help us. He can guide us. But now when we talk about believing in Jesus, we aren't talking about believing in Jesus as though it were some kind of wish or a whim. We're talking about believing. Believing. Last week I was at a training, and I was the only clergy in the group, and so there were 22 of us, and they came from all walks of life, all professions, and then there was me. And so it's unique when you're the only one in your field in something, especially when you're the pastor in the group. And so we were talking about different things, and we got off on the topic of words and how many words have lost their meaning over the years. And I said, yeah, I agree with that. Things like the word love. Other languages have multiple words for love. Like in Greek, you have eros and agape and philo. And so you have all different kinds of love. And in English, we have love. Pretty simple. But we use it, the way we use it is watered down. We love our children. We love our spouse. We love Pop-Tarts. We love basketball. We love, I don't know that all these are equal, or at least they should not. If your love for Pop-Tarts is equal to your love for your children, there's probably other work you need to do in your life. And then there's the word believe. We oftentimes will use believe as though it's guess. Where are the keys? I believe they're on the counter in the kitchen. Now, are you staking your life on that? Are you willing to stand on that regardless? No. Me personally, I'm not, because when I say I believe they're on the counter in the kitchen, it's probably because I have lost them and I'm stalling for time. It's a guess at best. Believe in John's gospel is never a guess. It's never a want. It's never a whim or a wish. We're talking about true belief. Being so persuaded by something, being so filled with conviction that it changes your life. That's what believing is about. It shapes who you are. Truly believing in Jesus allows you to learn from him as the way and the truth and the life, so that you aren't shaken up. Your hearts aren't troubled when you face adversity, when things fall apart. That's what Jesus is inviting us to do, to believe in him, because he wants to be that way and truth and life for us, because he loves us more than we can imagine. A love that he will show hours after he says this phrase. However, we often put our belief in other things. We believe in our intellect and our ability. We know that we can make it on our own. We can handle whatever comes our way because we're smart enough, we're educated enough, we have the skill set to do whatever it is. Some of us put our belief in our family or our friends. We know that they'll always do this and they'll always do that. And sometimes we put our belief in our finances, our resources. No matter what, we know, we believe we have enough money to see ourselves through. We can handle whatever situation comes our way. But I've seen a lot of people over the years put their belief in those things. And I've seen a lot of people let down by those things. Intellect and ability can't solve all your problems. Family and friends can at times disappoint. And money can't always fix what you're facing. When you strip everything else away, what do you believe in? And Jesus says we can believe in Him. He is the way and the truth and the life. He says, I'm showing you, I'm embodying for you the way that leads to life. Life here that is full and more abundant than you can imagine, and life eternal with the Father. I mean, there's basically two ways in life. One way that leads away from God and one way that leads to God. And Jesus says He's that way. The way that leads to God, the way that leads to us living that life that God is calling us to live and has created us to live. But we still have to make the choice. Do we follow His way in this complicated, messy, and rarely rational life? Do we follow His way and believe in Him? If we choose, we have to choose if we will follow His way or if we'll follow our own way. I mean, if we follow His way, it's not always going to be easy. We're going to be tempted to wander. We're going to be tempted to put our trust in other things. We're going to be tempted to sin and to follow our own course for our life, or really to listen to what the world's telling us. It's easy to be overwhelmed by that. But Jesus says, you want to know the way that leads to God? Look at me. He says, I am the way. Follow me. I'm going to model for you how to live according to God's will and God's plans and God's purposes. And in me, you'll find truth, and in me, you'll find life. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But is He that for you? Is His life, His example, His witness, His teachings, is that the path that you follow? Or are you zigzagging your way through life, following other things for a little while and then other things again and then back to something else and looking for answers and seeking your own way? Jesus is the way, but do you follow Him as the way? Do we truly follow the way, truly put our belief in Jesus so that we know that we can go through our life in a way that makes a difference, in a way where we find joy and we fulfill our purpose? A friend once shared that he said he starts his day every day by praying, "Today, Jesus, be for me the way, the truth, and the life. Help me to walk with you and not be afraid. And use me to point others to your way." Maybe we should start our day the same way. You see, Jesus is the way, but is He your way? Do you try every day to follow Him? Jesus is the truth, but is He your truth? Do you trust that Jesus is the truth, that His message is right? Regardless of what culture says, His principles do not change. Do you believe that He is the truth? And Jesus is the life. But do you gauge your life? What is good and what is bad, and what is right and what is wrong, and what comes first and what comes last? Do you do all of that by looking to Jesus to show you how to live a life that is full of purpose and meaning. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But the choice is up to you. Is he that for you? Because if he is, then that will change everything else. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.